Hey everyone, welcome back to the What If Machine. This week we're doing things a wee bit different. Now, because the What If Machine is fundamentally about where science meets video games, I wanted to take a look at the science of probably the most controversial topic in gaming, the alleged negative effects of playing violent video games. Wait, there's violence in video games? I really hadn't noticed. Okay, I stand corrected. I guess they can on occasion be a tad violent. Okay, or sometimes very violent. Jesus, that's messed up. Well, as anyone who's ever heard of video games and happens to live on the planet Earth will know, all this digital violence has got a number of people in a tiz about the effects it might be having on all of us, and especially teenagers and young children. Here at GameSpot UK headquarters though, we've been playing violent video games since we were kids, and we still do today, all the time. But look at us. We're just a bunch of average, happy-go-lucky guys and girls. Professionals, you might say, in a normal, calm office environment. Right, Johnny?
No, backhand.
Oh, sorry. Well, our anecdotal office drama aside, it's not a ridiculous notion that doing violent things in a virtual world could make you more inclined, or predisposed even, to do so in the real world as well. But does it? What's the evidence? What can science tell us?
I've got little or no doubt, and the evidence certainly suggests this, that certain types of gameplay will produce aggressive tendencies in people. Whether that translates into real-world violence or not is an entirely different topic. So I can get extremely aggressive trying to open a carton of milk. Similarly, I can get very aggressive or have very aggressive feelings at playing a video game. I don't think there's any sensible distinction between those types of emotions. The question is, do they translate into the real world? The evidence is insufficient for us to say with any degree of confidence that video games actually cause real-world violence.
Wow, that's in stark contrast with the majority of the media reporting and general political commentary. I guess you could argue that where violent games differ from, say, opening milk, is that you participate in simulated violence. That's got to make a difference, right?
There's no evidence that participating in a violent activity in a game has a greater effect on you than watching a violent act in a movie. In fact, there may be some forces which operate in the opposite direction. So if you believe that we have aggressive impulses, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we do have impulses, then it might be very psychologically healthy to find appropriate outlets for those impulses.
Ah, so kind of like a punch bag then. Some good old cathartic relief. Makes sense.
But we do have all of these folk beliefs about, well, if you run around shooting people, that's going to translate into your real-world behaviour. And people are much smarter than that. People are much more sensitive than that. People are not animals. They're intelligent, they're thoughtful, they know the distinction between fantasy and reality. So whereas it looks like an obvious, horrendous situation to present somebody with that kind of opportunity, it really doesn't lead to violent behaviour.
Okay, but what about realism? Now, it's not ridiculous to think that violence that looks almost real might have a more profound effect on us. It's certainly claimed enough by those who champion the dangers of playing violent video games. Well, it turns out that the evidence just isn't there, and trying to definitively prove it would require a very specific test. Mark explains.
I think in order to answer questions about the effects of very realistic violence on people, you'd need to have a very close comparison between two games that were more or less identical except for the level of realism. Because there are so many factors that affect our response to violence, the circumstances of the person against who the violence is perpetrated, for instance, is very hard to say.
In fact, this all ties nicely into one of the main difficulties when trying to investigate a link between violent video games and aggressive behaviour. What does the term violent video games actually mean?
The first thing that people really need to do, and this applies to researchers and the media, is to stop just using this kind of fake category of violent video games. Because it's an almost meaningless term. What do you mean by violent? Do you mean fast-paced? Do you mean extremely competitive? Do you mean gory? Do you mean there's lots of killing but it doesn't matter if there's blood involved or not? To take an example from 15 years ago, Carmageddon. Originally it was released, you could splatter pedestrians and blood would go everywhere. it was censored and they replaced the pedestrians with zombies, with green blood instead. But, you know, is red blood more violent than green blood? You know, these are questions which nobody really seems to be willing to tackle.
Defining violence in games is tricky. We shouldn't really have a binary distinction between violent and non-violent games, because many games involve violence to some degree or other. And in fact, I think a need in the research environment is the development of tools which allow us to come up with more objective measures of the sorts of violence that occur within a game.
After all, if different researchers are just choosing their own definition of violence in games, how are we supposed to compare different studies and work out an overall picture? Unfortunately, a lot of the same issues are present when defining and measuring aggression in people as well.
It's very difficult to get a tangible measure of aggression. And so a lot of these trials are relying on self-reporting. And in many of the cases, they're actually relying on the children themselves to report how aggressive they think they are. A child who is, you know, playing more aggressive games may not actually be more violent, but they may be more willing to report that they feel aggressive behaviour, or they may be less likely to cover up aggressive behaviour that they've committed in the past. And so you can sort of draw a correlation, but you can't really figure out any direct link or cause between the two unless you can somehow get to the bottom of that.
Right on my arse!
So why then, considering what we know about the research, does the wider media insist on spreading the notion that games do cause violent behaviour in real life?
I think we're scared of new media. I think whenever a new medium appears on the scene, particularly one which attracts our children or younger people in society, it's threatening.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
We feel threatened by things that are unfamiliar. If you look back at the sort of research topics that people are traditionally engaged in terms of examining their effects on violent behaviour, they've mirrored the types of media which have emerged. So we were worried about TV and we were worried about movies. We became worried about video games. I think in the next few years we'll probably see a rash of research which points to the effects of social media, because that's now the big thing that older people such as me are scared about. We've got a tendency to look for simple explanations. When a new medium comes along, it offers a beautiful, simple explanation.
It's as if people have an inherent need to believe that things are getting worse. And we see this particularly in certain tabloids like the Daily Mail say, you know, we're not any more violent than previous generations. If anything, crime has been falling pretty steadily over the last several decades. You know, there's no more increase in child abuse or abuse of spouses or anything like that. So if there really was some kind of significant impact being wrought on the population due to video games, why are we not seeing any evidence of it?
In fact, this is not just the case in our society. You could be forgiven for thinking that we live in an incredibly violent time in human history. However, the opposite is actually the case.
There is violence in the world, but there's probably a lot less than there ever has been at any point in recorded history. It's the safest and the healthiest and the most affluent state of our planet that's ever existed. I think what we have is we have 24/7 media coverage. We have tremendous focus on any act of violence, any act of aggression, anything that looks unusual or is shocking. The fact is, the world's a better place than it's ever been.
Now, there are many people who think that banning violent video games outright is the answer. After all, we can't currently conclusively prove that specific types of violent gameplay don't translate to real-world violence. For me, however, this is flawed reasoning. For one, proving a negative is incredibly tricky. Take Bigfoot, for example. Serious zoologists don't think it's very likely at all, but we can't prove it doesn't exist. But more to the point, life is about assessing risk, balancing positives with the negatives, and in this situation the risk is low. Plus, we already have age ratings on games with anything approaching violent content, so just like with films, if enforced effectively by retailers and, most important of all, parents, this should mitigate any reasonable risk to children. And what's more, if we come back to this notion of balancing positives and negatives, it turns out that there's a significant amount of evidence suggesting genuine benefits from playing video games, even the violent ones for us adults. This just so happens to be Mark's area of research, so I asked him to tell me more.
The evidence is probably about the same status as the evidence on aggression. That is, there are lots of interesting findings, but these have not really been translated into real-world observations, although there are some very interesting ideas there. First of all, if you play something like Modern Warfare, then you will improve your hand-eye coordination. Now, this is a useful skill in lots of different areas. MMOs have a great social component. In fact, most MMOs are designed around the principle that you can't complete all the challenges in the game on your own. As such, you have to engage in some sort of cooperative behaviour. That's a fantastic learning experience. Psychologists believe that fun is right at the heart of games. If they weren't fun, we wouldn't have so many people playing them, and we wouldn't have so many people worrying about them causing violent behaviour. But what we think fun actually does is it turns you into a more creative person. So you see you're presented with opportunities, you solve problems in interesting and novel ways. Then the suggestion is that those novel problem-solving strategies can be transferred into the real world. But that's how we learn to be more flexible individuals, through having fun.
So, there we have it. What seems clear is that accurately measuring the effects of playing violent video games is far more complicated than it seems at first. From talking to Mark, the evidence is fairly solid that certain types of gameplay can promote aggressive feelings. However, the key is that in contrast, the evidence is insufficient to suggest any link between this aggression and real-world violence. Plus, there's a significant amount of evidence suggesting a whole load of positive reasons to play video games, including violent ones. What seems clear to me is that this is a complicated topic that definitely needs further study, and thanks to people like Mark, this is happening. However, what needs to change is the reporting. Media outlets need to take a lesson from the likes of Martin and stop fixating on individual studies and drawing simplistic conclusions or blowing them way out of proportion. Each study needs to be looked at in the context of the wider research. That's how science works. Most important of all, in my opinion, is that those who make ridiculous or unsubstantiated causative links between games and acts of violence need to be named and shamed. Not only does this muddy the reputation of video games, but more importantly, it overlooks the serious, more complex reasons why people unfortunately choose to do these terribly sad things. But what do you think? Let me know your thoughts on violent video games in the comments. Do you agree with the conclusions of this show? Let me know, as always, in the comments, or you can hook me up over Twitter at CamFrazRob using the hashtag WhatIfMachine. Okay, now next week we're going to go back to science fiction in video games, and this one, folks, is going to be massive.